In a courtroom built on pride and power, justice doesn't always wear white robes. Tonight's story reminds us that prejudice blinds even the mighty, and that sometimes the person you condemn is the only one who can save your life. If you love stories with truth, emotion, and a lesson that stays with you, subscribe to Mr. Edwin Stories, where every story reveals the price of a single choice. The courtroom was silent, only the echo of the judge's gavel filled the air. The old wooden walls carried stories of many trials, but none like this, none filled with such cold judgment, such quiet cruelty. As the morning light crept through the stained windows, a young pregnant woman stood trembling. Her hands resting on her swollen belly, her eyes lowered, her heart heavy. She had done nothing wrong, yet the weight of accusation pressed on her like chains she could not break. The whispers in the room were soft but sharp, they cut through her spirit like blades. She heard words like undeserving and unfit, and each syllable carved pain deeper into her soul. Judge sat high above her, his robe perfectly black, his gaze cold as iron. His name was Judge Harrison Crown, a man respected by many but feared by more. Behind that polished wooden bench sat decades of prejudice, hidden beneath law and pride. His heart beat slower now, weaker with every year. And though he smiled, deep inside his chest pain echoed like a warning he refused to hear. He looked at the woman before him and saw not a mother, not a human being, but a reflection of his own bitterness. The kind of hatred that grows quietly, like mold in forgotten corners of the soul. The woman's name was Elena. Gentle in voice, soft in presence, yet strong in ways unseen. She had walked miles to reach this courtroom, her body tired, her spirit burning with the faintest light of hope. The hope that maybe justice still existed. The accusation against her was absurd, a false claim that she had stolen medicine from the town clinic. She tried to explain that she was the one who made it, the one who had been working on something that could save lives, but no one listened. Her voice was drowned by the murmurs of disbelief, because to them she was not a scientist, not a healer, just another face they did not wish to understand. Judge Crown cleared his throat, the sound heavy and deliberate. He read the charges with a tone that carried disdain. His words were like stones thrown at her from above, each one pushing her further down. She tried to meet his eyes but couldn't, not because she was weak, but because she could see nothing human there, only judgment dressed as justice. She whispered softly under her breath a prayer for strength, her hands shaking as she clutched a small envelope hidden inside her coat. Inside it lay the formula. The only vaccine that could cure a rare heart disease, a disease slowly eating away at the very man condemning her. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. The storm pressed its face against the courtroom windows. As if heaven itself was watching in silence, the air was thick, filled with tension that no one could name. Judge Crown began his speech about order, law, and duty, words he had repeated so many times they had lost meaning. He spoke of morality while ignoring his own reflection. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass, but he hid it quickly, pretending all was well. Pretending the pain in his chest was nothing but fatigue, pretending he was in control of fate. Lena looked up once more, her voice steady now. She spoke of truth, of compassion, of forgiveness, but her words were met with laughter from the crowd, faint smirks, rolling eyes. The judge slammed his gavel and called for silence, yet there was no silence inside him. Something in her tone shook him, something he could not name. He felt a strange pulse behind his ribs, a sharp reminder of the illness he hid from everyone, a disease that not even the best doctors could cure, but he dismissed it with pride. He would never show weakness, especially not before someone like her. The trial continued for hours, and as the rain beat harder against the glass, the courtroom grew colder. Elena's breathing became shallow, the weight of her pregnancy pressing heavily on her body. Still she stood unwavering, her voice never breaking as she pleaded her case. She told them of her research, her years of work to create a vaccine for the disease that had taken her husband's life. She told them that it was her life's mission, that she had finally succeeded, that the cure was real, but again. No one listened, not even the man whose life depended on it. When the verdict came, it was as cruel as the silence that followed. Guilty. The word echoed like a death sentence. Her knees buckled, and the envelope slipped from her hand unnoticed by all but one man, the court clerk, who picked it up absent-mindedly and placed it with the rest of the evidence. Judge Crown signed the papers, his chest tightening again, sweat forming on his brow, but his pride refused to yield as she was led away. Her eyes met his one last time. And in that brief moment, something flickered in his gaze, something that looked like recognition, like fate whispering softly, "Your cure stands before you, and you have condemned it." Outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of dust and regret. Elena was placed in the back of a van, her hands trembling as she felt her child kick gently, a promise of life amid injustice. She whispered softly, "I forgive you," though no one heard. As the van drove away, the judge sat alone in his chambers. Staring at his reflection in the window, his heart beat uneven, the world around him suddenly quieter, and for the first time in his long career. The gavel on his desk looked like a weight he could no longer lift. He closed his eyes and pressed a hand against his chest, the pain sharp now, deep, unrelenting, and somewhere in the silence of that dark office, the whisper of destiny stirred, soft but certain, because justice, even when delayed, always finds its way back. Night descended over the city like a slow curtain. The courthouse stood in silence, its lamps flickering like fading memories. Judge Crown sat in his office long after everyone had gone. The rain had stopped, but the air remained heavy, thick with the weight of guilt he refused to name. His desk was cluttered with papers, verdicts, and half-finished notes. Yet all he could see was her face, that quiet strength in her eyes, the strange calm that unsettled him more than her words ever could. He tried to shake the thought from his mind, but it lingered, hovering like a ghost at the edge of reason. His hand moved to his chest again, the pain sharper now, a pulsing reminder of something beyond medicine. He had hidden his condition from everyone, not even his daughter knew how sick he was. Pride was his armor, but now that armor began to crack. He reached for a bottle of pills on the desk and swallowed two without water. The bitterness lingered on his tongue, his body shuddered slightly. He stared at the rain-streaked window, watching the reflection of the courtroom lights fade into the distance. He whispered nothing, yet his silence spoke of 1,000 regrets. In another part of the building, a janitor swept through the empty hall, his broom scraping softly across the tiles. He found a small brown envelope among the scattered evidence, its edges damp from the rain that had blown in earlier. Curious, he placed it aside, not knowing it carried the most precious secret of all, the formula written by the woman the world refused to believe, the vaccine that could cure the very disease that ate away at Judge Crown's heart. Fate had left it there quietly, as if waiting for the right moment to reveal its purpose. Meanwhile, Elena sat in a dim cell, the walls gray and the air cold, her hands cradling her belly. She felt her child move and smiled faintly through exhaustion. She had always believed that goodness, even when buried under hatred, could still grow. Her body ached, but her spirit remained strong. She prayed not for her freedom, but for understanding, that one day the world would see what hatred had cost. The quiet hum of the prison light filled the silence, and she closed her eyes, whispering forgiveness into the darkness, forgiveness for the man who could never return it. Back in his office, Judge Crown leaned back in his chair, his breath uneven, the pain now constant. He reached for the framed photograph on his desk, a picture of his late wife, her smile soft, her eyes kind. She had died of the same heart condition he now suffered from, the disease that no doctor had been able to cure. The irony clawed at him. He had sentenced a woman to prison for trying to heal, and he, the man of law, had no cure for his own sins. The image blurred as his eyes filled with tears he would never admit to anyone. The next morning arrived gray and silent. The janitor turned in the lost envelope along with the rest of the items. It ended up on the desk of a young intern assigned to organize the court's evidence room. She noticed the handwriting on it, neat but faint, marked with the initials AM. Curiosity made her open it, and what she saw made her pause. Detailed formulas, notes about a serum, words about compassion, forgiveness, and healing written between chemical codes. She didn't understand it all, but she felt something sacred in those lines. She placed it carefully in a separate folder, unaware that within those papers lay the cure for the disease that would soon bring the judge to his knees. Judge Crown attended court that morning, pale and weary, every step heavier than the last. His daughter sat in the front row, watching with concern. She had noticed his decline, but he refused to rest. His voice trembled slightly as he read through another case, yet he continued pretending that control still belonged to him. The courtroom lights seemed brighter than usual, almost cruel in their glare. Sweat formed on his forehead as he reached for his glass, his vision blurred for a second. The edges of the world dimming, but he caught himself before anyone noticed. That afternoon a letter arrived on his desk, sealed with no name, just a simple note inside that read, "Sometimes the law fails, but mercy never does." He frowned, tossing it aside, unaware that the note had been slipped in by the same intern who had found Elena's formula, unaware that the universe was whispering to him through the smallest of gestures, unaware that his fate had already begun to turn. Days passed and his health worsened. The doctors spoke of surgery of hope, but he knew better. He felt it deep in his bones, the slow decay of life, the punishment of arrogance. He lay awake at night, haunted by the image of the pregnant woman, her eyes filled with both pain and grace. She had offered him mercy even when he gave her none. And that mercy, that unexplainable kindness, began to erode the walls he had built his whole life. Every breath reminded him of the courtroom. Every heartbeat reminded him of her voice. In her cell, Elena began to write again. She had requested paper and pen, hoping to finish what she started. She poured her thoughts onto the page, not out of bitterness but out of faith. She wrote about forgiveness, about how hate can blind even the most educated, about how love can still bloom in the darkest corners. She did not know that far away the same man who condemned her was slowly dying, that her words would soon reach him in the most unexpected way. Judge Crown grew weaker by the week. His daughter begged him to rest, but he refused. He still attended court, still clung to the image of control, but deep inside something had shifted. He began to hear echoes of his own verdicts in his dreams, every voice of the condemned whispering through the walls, and among them always hers, always Elena's, calm and forgiving, her voice like a mirror reflecting the truth he had long denied. And with each passing day, he realized how little justice had ever meant compared to mercy. One night, as the pain became unbearable, he collapsed in his study, the glass shattering beside him. His daughter rushed in, her screams echoing down the hall. Doctors were called, lights flickered, and in the chaos, someone handed her a file that had been delivered to his desk that very morning. A file labeled with the same initials, AM, the one he had ignored, the one that contained the only cure he would ever need. His daughter held it in her trembling hands as the doctors worked to save him. Unaware of the cruel irony, unaware that salvation had arrived too late. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, Judge Crown saw flashes of his past, the faces of those he had judged, the moments he chose pride over compassion, law over love. His heartbeat slowed, the sound distant, fading. Then in the quiet between breaths he saw her face again, not accusing, not vengeful, but peaceful, forgiving. She reached out her hand. And in that final instant he understood the law can punish, but mercy heals. His eyes closed, and for the first time he felt no pain, only stillness. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft and cleansing, as if the heavens themselves wept for him. And somewhere miles away, in a cold prison cell, Elena woke from a dream she could not explain. She placed a hand over her heart and whispered a prayer, not knowing that the man who condemned her had just found his redemption through the mercy she never stopped giving. The morning after Judge Crown's passing was quiet. The courthouse corridors were filled with whispers and soft footsteps. People spoke his name with a mix of sorrow and shock. Some remembered his firmness, others his pride, but very few remembered his kindness because he had rarely shown it. His death left an emptiness in the very place that once feared him, a symbol of authority now turned into a tale of warning. His seat stood empty, the gavel resting cold on the desk, untouched, as though the weight of his choices still lingered there. His daughter, Evelyn Crown, stood beside his casket days later, her face pale, her eyes swollen from tears. She had loved her father deeply, yet she had always sensed the shadow in him, the part of him that carried judgment instead of compassion. As she held his hand one last time, she felt the stiffness of regret that life leaves behind when time runs out. In her purse was the file marked with the initials AM. She had read through it countless times, the formulas, the research notes. The words of hope written by a woman her father had destroyed. She now understood the truth, that the same woman he condemned had created the cure he needed most. And in that realization she felt both grief and duty, grief for the father she had lost, and duty for the life her father had taken unjustly. The funeral was simple. The rain fell softly like the sky mourning quietly. Evelyn stood beside the grave as the earth covered the casket, each sound of soil falling over wood echoing like a confession. She closed her eyes and whispered a silent promise that she would find the woman her father wronged, that she would make right what he had broken, that mercy would no longer go unheard. When she turned to leave, a single beam of sunlight pierced through the gray clouds, warm and faint, yet enough to make her pause. As if the universe itself had heard her vow. Meanwhile, Elena's life in the prison continued with slow days and sleepless nights. Her pregnancy had reached its final weeks. Every movement from her child was both pain and promise. The guards treated her with indifference. The other inmates watched her with quiet curiosity. No one really knew her story, only that she was different. She spent her days writing on scraps of paper, her thoughts flowing like gentle rivers. She wrote not of revenge but of redemption, not of hatred but of hope. She believed that somewhere, somehow, good would still find her, that her suffering had meaning beyond her cell. On the day her labor began, the sky outside was painted red with sunrise. She was rushed to the infirmary, her breath short, her body trembling, yet her spirit unbroken. Hours passed in waves of pain and light, until at last the cry of a newborn filled the air, a baby boy, small, warm, and perfect. The nurse looked at her with softened eyes, perhaps for the first time seeing her not as a prisoner but as a mother. Elena smiled weakly and whispered a name, Gabriel. She said it with love. Her voice barely a breath, the sound carried through the sterile room like a promise. Days later, Evelyn arrived at the prison, holding the same file her father had left behind. Her request to meet Elena had been approved. The meeting room was small and dimly lit, divided by glass. When Elena entered, pale and tired, their eyes met, and the silence between them spoke louder than words ever could. Evelyn placed the file on the counter, her hand trembling. She said softly that she came to make things right. Though the words never passed her lips, her eyes said it all. Elena's gaze held no anger, only the calm acceptance of one who had already forgiven. The air between them felt heavy yet sacred, like two souls meeting at the edge of fate. Evelyn explained that her father had passed, and in his final hours he had clung to the same papers that held Elena's cure. She confessed that she did not understand why fate had woven their lives together this way, but she knew one thing: she could not let her father's mistake be the final chapter. She offered Elena a chance at freedom, a hearing to reopen her case. Her voice broke slightly as she promised to tell the world the truth, that Elena was not a thief but a healer, that her research could save millions, and that her compassion had saved even the man who wronged her. Tears filled Elena's eyes as she listened, but she did not weep for herself. She wept for the world that had to lose something before it could learn to value it. She placed her hand over her heart, whispering softly that mercy was never wasted even when unseen, that forgiveness had a way of returning like sunlight through clouds. Evelyn nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She reached through the opening in the glass to hold Elena's hand, two women bound by pain yet united by purpose. One carrying the guilt of the past, the other carrying the grace to heal it. Weeks later, Elena's case was reopened. The truth spread slowly through the news. The people who once mocked her began to see her differently. Scientists reviewed her formula and confirmed what she had said all along, that it was the only effective vaccine against a heart condition once thought incurable. Her name began to rise not in fame, but in respect. She was granted release, and on the day she stepped out of the prison gates, the same rain that had followed her condemnation now fell softly on her face. But this time it felt different, cleansing, forgiving. She held her son close and looked at the sky, whispering a silent prayer for the man who once judged her, a prayer not of hate but of peace. Evelyn was waiting outside, her car parked near the gate. When their eyes met again, neither spoke, they simply embraced. And in that embrace, generations of pain seemed to ease. Elena handed her a small piece of paper. It was a letter she had written long ago, addressed to Judge Crown. It spoke of understanding, of healing, of how love can still exist even in places of cruelty. Evelyn read it later that night and wept. She placed the letter beside her father's portrait, whispering that mercy had finally come home. As weeks passed, Elena's vaccine was released worldwide under her name, saving countless lives. Hospitals across the country began to use it. and her story became one that doctors told not only as science but as faith. The world learned of her courage, her forgiveness, and her unshakable belief that compassion was stronger than judgment. And though she rarely spoke of the past, she never forgot. She would sometimes stand by the window at night, watching her son sleep, and whisper to the stars, "Justice is not vengeance, justice is mercy remembered." That night, as the wind moved through the quiet streets, Evelyn sat by her window holding her father's pocket watch. Its ticking slow, its rhythm steady. She thought of the woman her father had condemned and the mercy that woman had shown. She thought of how fate had twisted pain into purpose, loss into redemption. And in her heart she felt peace, because even though the past could not be changed, its weight could be carried differently, with grace instead of guilt, with love instead of fear, and somewhere beyond the stars, perhaps a weary soul finally rested, free from the chains of pride, forgiven by the very heart it had once broken. The rain had not stopped since that dreadful day in court. The world outside the small prison hospital seemed to weep for the injustice that had taken place. The walls smelled of disinfectant and regret, and the air carried a strange stillness. Amara lay on the narrow bed, her body weak, her spirit exhausted. Yet her eyes were filled with something pure, something unbroken. She was no longer the trembling woman who had stood before the judge. She was now a mother in waiting, and within her womb, miracle-stirred days had turned into weeks since the trial. The judge's ruling had been swift and merciless. He had sentenced her without remorse, his words heavy with the pride of a man blinded by the illusion of power. But fate, quiet and patient, was already working its own sentence upon him. His health had begun to crumble, the pain in his chest had grown sharper, his breath shorter, his hands shaking whenever he tried to write. He had hidden it from everyone, but no lie could hide forever, especially not from the shadow of one's own heart. The nurse who had witnessed it all, Sister Liana, visited Amara every day. She brought her bread, water, and sometimes, when no one was watching, hope. She had read Amara's old notes hidden in the folds of her clothes when she was arrested, and she understood the truth. Amara was no criminal, she was a healer. She had discovered a vaccine that could cure the disease that plagued the very man who condemned her. Sister Liana wept when she realized it. Not from pity, but from awe. She promised Amara that the world would one day know her name. Amara's time was near, her body heavy, her breath shallow. The guards outside her door spoke in low voices, mocking her, calling her names that cut deeper than any knife. Yet she smiled. She knew something they didn't. The pain she carried was not only the pain of labor, it was the pain of rebirth. The universe had chosen her, and her child would be born not in a palace, but in a cell under the eyes of hate, but guarded by love unseen. Meanwhile, the judge sat in his grand house, surrounded by silence, his heart beating irregularly, his pulse fatting in waves. He could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, calm, forgiving, and his conscience burned. His wife had left months ago, tired of his bitterness. His friends had abandoned him, afraid of his condition. He had only his pride left, but even that was slipping through his trembling fingers. He reached for his medicine, but it no longer worked. The doctors had told him quietly that his time was short. The disease was winning. At midnight, thunder rolled again, and somewhere between pain and fear, he collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. His hands trembling in his final moments of consciousness, he whispered her name, not even knowing why. Amara. And then silence. Back in the prison, Amara screamed as life tore its way into the world. Sister Liana held her hand, whispering prayers. The rain pounded against the windows, lightning flashed, and in that blinding white light a baby's cry pierced the darkness. It was pure, strong, alive, a sound of defiance against everything that sought to destroy it. Amara wept, her tears mixing with the rain that leaked through the cracks in the ceiling. She looked at her child and whispered softly, "Your name will be Hope, because you were born when the world had none." Sister Liana wrapped the baby gently, her hands trembling. She knew this child was different. There was something divine in the way her tiny heart beat, steady, powerful, like it carried the rhythm of 1,000 generations. She told Amara to rest, and when the mother finally drifted into sleep, the nurse wrote a letter, a confession of all she had seen, the injustice, the cure, the truth. Days later, the news spread quietly through the city. The judge had died suddenly, his heart failing without warning. But his death was not the end, it was the beginning. Because the same disease that had taken him had begun to spread rapidly across the region, panic rose, fear consumed the people, and the government began searching desperately for a cure. The same cure that Amara had already discovered. The same cure locked away in her mind and her blood. Sister Liana carried Hope in her arms and walked through the rain, heading toward the city hospital. She knew what she had to do. She carried Amara's notes close to her heart, and the newborn against her chest as she walked. She whispered to the child that one day, her mother's name would clear the sky of prejudice. One day justice would not be written by the color of skin but by the strength of the soul. And somewhere beyond the storm, Amara's spirit watched over them, her lips forming a silent prayer of gratitude, because even though she had been condemned by hate, she had given birth to something far greater, the cure for the heart of a dying world, the birth of hope the morning after the judge's death. The city was cloaked in a fog that moved like grief itself, silent and heavy, covering the courthouse steps and drifting through the narrow streets. People whispered his name in hushed tones, some in mourning, others in quiet satisfaction, because for many he had been a symbol of power without mercy, a man who wore the law like armor but underneath it hid the sickness of hatred. His death seemed sudden, but to those who had seen him closely, it was only the final judgment of a heart that had long been dying. His son Ethan returned home that same morning, his face pale, his eyes red from the flight and the sleepless nights before it. He had not spoken to his father in years. Their last words had been sharp and cruel. Ethan had chosen a life far from the cold weight of his father's courtroom. He had worked in medicine, researching the same disease that had claimed his father's heart when he entered the grand house. The smell of medicine and dust hit him like a wall, and for the first time he saw the weakness his father had always hidden, the trembling hands, the scattered pills, the untouched food on the table. He felt no anger then, only sorrow. Among his father's papers, Ethan found the court files of Amara, her picture clipped to the corner, her eyes calm even in the face of judgment. Something about her gaze unsettled him. It was as if she had known this would happen. As if she had seen beyond the walls of hate and into the future where justice would find its own voice. Ethan began to read, and the deeper he went, the more his heart broke. There was no real crime, no evidence, only prejudice wrapped in legal words. His father had destroyed an innocent woman, and now she was gone, buried under the weight of his decision. But fate, once again, was not finished. That same afternoon, a knock echoed through the mansion, slow and uncertain. Ethan opened the door and found a woman standing in the rain, her uniform soaked, her eyes tired but determined. She introduced herself as Sister Liana, and in her arms, wrapped in a thin cloth, was a newborn child. She looked at Ethan with tears in her eyes and whispered, "This is Amara's daughter, and she carries what your father needed most." Ethan stepped back, confusion flooding his mind. He invited her in, and as she spoke, every truth came to light. Amara's research, her vaccine, the trial, the cruelty, the silence, all of it unfolded like a confession of a world's sin. Sister Liana handed him a small notebook, its pages filled with formulas, annotations, and one final message written in delicate handwriting. It read, "If love cannot heal the heart, maybe science can." Ethan spent nights studying her work, piecing together her formula, and in it he found brilliance beyond measure. She had done what entire institutions had failed to achieve. Her discovery was real and it could save thousands, but the bitter truth stung deeper than any wound. She had been executed before she could ever share it. Condemned by the same system that now begged for salvation, Ethan sat in silence, staring at the name on the notebook, his hands trembling. He whispered softly, "I will make them remember her." As the days passed, the vaccine was tested, improved, and finally approved. It became the first effective treatment for the heart disease that had taken so many lives. But Ethan refused to attach his own name to it. He insisted it be called the Amara cure, in honor of the woman his father had wronged. Newspapers carried her story. The headlines spoke of redemption, of justice found too late, but still it was found at night. Ethan often visited his father's grave, standing beneath the weeping trees, the wind cold and steady. He would speak quietly, his voice breaking, saying that the woman his father destroyed had saved him, saved everyone. He hoped somewhere, somehow, his father's spirit could hear, not out of vengeance, but forgiveness. Sister Liana continued her quiet service, caring for hope as if she were her own. The child grew quickly, her eyes bright, her smile gentle. She had her mother's strength. The rain had returned that night, soft and steady against the windows of Hope's office, the kind of rain that carried memories instead of cold. She sat alone at her desk, her lamp dim, the papers before her untouched. She had finished a long day of work, meetings, interviews, and the endless noise that came with leading a foundation that now reached across continents. Yet despite all the progress, something restless stirred within her, an ache that no amount of success could silence. An emptiness shaped like the mother she never truly knew. She stood up, walked toward the archive room at the back of the building, and turned the light on. The walls were lined with shelves filled with her mother's old notebooks, files, and photos collected over the years, things Sister Liana had saved and passed down. Hope ran her fingers across the spines, feeling the dust and the quiet history in each one, until her hand stopped on a small, faded box tucked behind a row of documents. Its label barely visible under the age stains, it read in faint ink, "For my child, when she is ready." Her heart began to race, her hands trembling as she pulled the box down and carried it to her desk. She sat slowly, afraid to open it, as if it contained the voice of a ghost she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. The rain tapped louder, thunder rolled in the distance, and then with a deep breath she lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded piece of yellowed paper tied with a thin string, and beside it, a small silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a heart. Hope untied the string, unfolded the letter, and as she began to read, the world seemed to still around her. Every sound faded, leaving only her mother's words. "My dearest child, if you are reading this, it means the world has changed enough to allow you to live freely. It means the darkness that once surrounded me has lifted enough for light to reach you. I wrote this not to make you grieve, but to remind you that life, no matter how cruel it appears, always finds a way to forgive itself. I know that by the time you hold this letter, I will not be with you, but I will have lived in every breath you took. In every moment you chose kindness over hate. You were my greatest discovery, the proof that love could still be born in a place that refused to see it. They took everything from me, but they could not take you, and that was enough. I worked not for recognition, but for the chance to build a world where no child would be punished for being different, where no one's worth would be weighed by the color of their skin. You, my child, are that dream made flesh." Hope stopped reading for a moment, her eyes filling with tears. The ink on the paper had faded in some parts, but every word carried warmth, like her mother's voice speaking through the years. She pressed the letter to her chest, breathing slowly before continuing. "If you ever doubt your purpose, remember this. Healing is not just medicine, it is forgiveness, and forgiveness is the highest form of justice. They will tell you to fight, and you should, but fight with compassion, not with hate. For hate is what blinded the judge, and compassion is what will heal the world. And if you ever meet the family of the man who condemned me, do not curse them, for they too were lost in a world that taught them blindness. Show them that mercy is stronger than any verdict, because when we choose mercy, we teach humanity how to begin again." At the bottom of the letter was one final line written faintly, as if her mother's hand had trembled while writing it. "Your name is Hope, because that is what I wanted the world to become." Hope sat still for a long time, unable to speak. The room filled with silence, broken only by the sound of the rain. She looked at the necklace and fastened it around her neck, feeling the cold metal warm against her skin. She felt her mother's spirit surround her like a soft embrace. Later that night, she walked to the rooftop of the foundation, the city lights shimmering below. She stood under the rain, eyes closed, face lifted to the sky, and whispered, "I found you, Mama, and I will keep your promise." She raised her hand toward the clouds and said softly, "From this night onward, every cure we create, every life we save will carry your name." The next morning she called a meeting with the board, her voice firm but full of grace. She announced a new division within the foundation, one dedicated to protecting mothers and children in unjust systems. She named it the Amara Project. Its mission simple: to defend those who could not defend themselves, to make sure no voice was silenced. Again, years later, that project would grow into a movement that reformed court systems around the world, merging science and justice, bringing fairness where there had once been fear. Hope became more than a doctor. She became a symbol, a reminder that from suffering could come healing, from silence could come truth. And in the quiet hours of her life, she would still return to that letter, reading it over and over, letting her mother's words guide her through every doubt, every heartbreak, every victory. Because even after death, Amara's voice never faded. It echoed through generations, whispering that forgiveness is not weakness. It is the courage to love in a world that once forgot how the years moved like the wind, gentle but unstoppable, carrying change across nations. Whispers turned into voices, and those voices became movements. The Amara Foundation had grown beyond imagination, touching continents that once knew nothing of its name, hospitals built where there were none, laws rewritten to protect those who had long been forgot. And every building, every ward, every plaque carried the same words engraved in gold, in memory of Amara, who healed the heart of humanity. Hope stood before a vast crowd on the day the world celebrated what would come to be known as Amara Day, a day when governments, schools, and people of every color paused to remember the woman who had been judged for her skin, but who had saved even those who condemned her. The air was warm, filled with music and prayer. Thousands of people held candles, their flames flickering together like one great light. The city square glowed with portraits of Amara, her calm eyes forever looking forward as if she were still watching over them, stepped to the podium, the necklace with the silver heart resting against her chest. The same one her mother had left behind. She looked out at the sea of faces before her, faces that reflected every shade of the human soul, and when she began to speak, her voice carried both strength and grace. She spoke of a time when fear ruled hearts, when justice was a word twisted by power, and how one woman changed that not by hatred, but by love. She told them of her mother's courage, her sacrifice, and the letter that had taught her that healing begins when we choose forgiveness over revenge. Her words moved through the crowd like wind through leaves, stirring emotions buried for generations. Tears fell, hands joined, and for the first time in history, humanity stood united in gratitude for one woman's heart as hope finished. A silence settled, deep and reverent, and then from the crowd came a song, low and gentle at first, rising higher as more voices joined. It was the song of redemption, of rebirth, of remembering. People began lighting more candles, placing them before the great statue that stood in the center of the square. A statue of Amara holding a child in her arms, the child reaching out with open hands toward the sky. Beneath it, carved in marble, were her last words: when the world forgets to love, remind it that mercy still breathes. That night the city was brighter than the stars, every window glowing with light, every heart reminded that compassion was not weakness but power. The rain that began to fall did not extinguish the candles. It only made them shimmer more beautifully. Reflections of hope dancing across the wet streets. Hope watched from the balcony of her foundation's headquarters, her hair now streaked with silver, her face calm, her eyes full of peace. She knew her time was nearing its end, but she felt no fear, only fulfillment. She thought of her mother, of Sister Liana, of Ethan, of all the souls who had carried the torch before her. She felt them with her in that moment, unseen but close, like the pulse of the earth itself. Later, in the quiet of her office, Hope sat at her desk, a single candle burning beside her. She took out her journal and began to write her final entry. The world has changed, Mama. They remember your name now, not as a victim, but as a healer, not as a woman judged, but as one who taught us how to see. Every year they gather to speak of your courage. Every hospital built carries your light. Every cure found echoes your love. And I, your daughter, have done my part. Now I rest knowing that mercy has found its home again. She closed the book, leaned back in her chair, and looked out at the horizon where the first light of dawn was breaking, soft gold melting into the deep blue sky. She smiled faintly, whispering, I am coming home, Mama. The candle flickered once, then went out. When morning came, the nurses found her seated peacefully, her face serene, her hand resting over the necklace, the sunlight bathing her in warmth. The news spread quickly. And though the world mourned her passing, it celebrated her life even more. They buried her beside her mother, under the same flowering tree where Sister Liana had once prayed, and on their shared tombstone they carved the words mother and daughter who healed the hearts of men. Centuries later, their story would still be told, not just as history, but as legend. Children would learn of the woman who was condemned but cured the world, of the daughter who carried her mother's light into eternity. Artists would paint their faces, poets would write of their grace, and in every place where hatred tried to rise again, their names would be spoken as a reminder that love, once awakened, never dies. And so the story ends where it began, in a courtroom long forgot by time, now covered in ivy and sunlight, birds nesting in its broken windows, silence resting where judgment once thundered, and if you listen closely you can almost hear a whisper in the wind. A voice soft and eternal saying, for every heart that suffers, there is a still hope. Subscribe to Mr. Edwin Stories. Thank you for watching. Bye.